Well, good morning again, brethren and sisters. We come to the second last full day of our Bible school here in Jerusalem, and it's going to be another busy day. We have two sessions this morning to cover 2 Chronicles chapter 24, which we've just read together. And there is some marvellous things in here. It's another story, of course, of sadness, because we have a young man who is guided by Jehoiada to bring Judah to a point where things are going very, very well. But as soon as Jehoiada dies, the wheels fall off and Joash crumbles away. And his end is one of the most exquisite examples of divine poetic justice in the Word of God. And we'll come to that in our second session this morning, God willing. So, the situation that we've been looking at, of course, with these kings who were reformers but then failed, has brought us now from Asa through Jehoshaphat to Joash, and we spoke briefly about the survival of this 1 6-month-old baby in the house of David because of the terrible consequences of Jehoshaphat's triple, and it was a triple compromise with the house of Ahab. He compromised with Ahab, and then with Ahaziah, and then with Jehoram, the son of Ahab. And so it brought Judah to its knees. So this is the period of history that we're going to be considering this morning, the life of Joash. And you'll notice that to the north, the yellow band, we have, of course, Jehu reigning in Jerusalem. He was the one that God appointed to clean up the Baal worship of Israel and to destroy the house of Ahab. I want you to come just back a chapter or so to 2 Chronicles 22, and we'll take up the story of what happened when Jehu had killed Ahaziah, the son of Athel. And verse 10 tells us that. So just in the previous verse, verse 9, we have the record of the death of 22-year-old or 23-year-old Ahaziah, and then we have this terrible record of verse 10 of 2 Chronicles 22. But when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the seed royal of the house of Judah. Now, her actions here, of course, verify our suggestion from chapter 21 that she was behind the slaughter of all of her husband's brothers so that there could be no competition to the throne. And that's exactly what she's doing here. She wants to rule Judah. She wants no competition to the throne. So therefore she has to expunge the life of every son of David. Every heir of David has to be destroyed if she's going to rule. She misses out by one. Now can you imagine a grandmother running around the palace, probably with one or two of her supporters in tow, slitting the throats, cutting the throats of her own grandchildren? I mean, that's stupendous, isn't it, in its horror? But that's exactly what she does. And we read this record. When she saw that Ahaziah was dead, she arose and destroyed all the seed royal of the house of Judah. But God intervenes, and he intervenes in the form of the wife of Jehoiada, Jehoshabath. Now, as you can see on the screen, her name means whose oath is Yahweh. That is, she's dedicated to him. So she, seeing what is happening, intervenes. But Jehoshabath, the daughter of the king, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him from among the king's sons that were slain, or as the Hebrew has it, that were being slain. So this is an action that she's taking while there is these screams coming from the children who are being butchered by Athaliah and her men. Can you imagine that? So she hears the screaming, she looks out the door and sees what's going on, and immediately acts to save the little boy Joash, the youngest son of the house of David, from being murdered by his own grandmother. And so we then see, in the record of verse 11, she stole him from among the king's sons that were being slain and put him and his nurse in a bedchamber. And actually that's the idea that they probably hid under some kind of bed or behind the bedding. So Jehoshabath, the daughter of King Jehoram, the wife of Jehoiada the priest, for she was a sister of Ahaziah, hid him from Athaliah so that she slew him not. So she was, of course, she was the auntie of this child, Joash, that was saved. So it's a close relation to her. And he was with them hid in the house of God 6 years, and as we read yesterday, Athaliah reigned over the land, but not over the people of the land. So what a wonderful woman she is in this crisis in Judah. Yahweh is able to choose to pick people for the moment, and he chooses this one, but she's no ordinary woman. Okay, she's actually a princess of the house of David, the daughter of Jehoram, possibly by another wife. She may not have been a full sister to Ahaziah, but she was certainly, her father was Jehoram, Athaliah's husband. She's the only recorded princess to marry the high priest in Israel's history. She could not have been older, and you can do the sums for yourself. She could not have been older than 28. She was probably younger than that. Jehoiada could not have been any younger than 95. And we know from the timings. Now, this is a curious marriage, isn't it? You've got a 95-year-old man who's a high priest, who's married to a princess of the house of David, who was only 25, 26, 27 years of age, somewhere in that range. Okay? This produced a unique son. I only had one son, but he's a unique son, isn't he? Because in actual fact, he's got royal blood, he's got priestly blood. He's a royal priest. He is, as it were, in the elect form, a king priest. Okay, that's what he's going to end up being, isn't he? A king priest. So this is a wonderful marriage, a curious marriage, but one, of course, that was to save the covenants of God to David from ruin. So he used faithful people for that purpose. Zachariah, their son, was between 30 and 40 when murdered by Joash, and I would like to think that maybe he was about 33, because you see he is used as a type of our Lord Jesus Christ, and I'll show you that a little later on in our second session. Now, these two boys, the one we've just read about, who was with Jehoiada and Jehoshabath, hid in the house of God for 6 years, grew up together in the temple. So Joash and Zachariah are growing up together. They're cousins, aren't they? So here was the place where they grew up. So they had the same education, all right? Zachariah was heir to the high priesthood and a son of David on his mother's side. So you've got the rightful heir to David's throne. You've got the heir to the high priesthood and a son of David on his mother's side. What a unique situation that is. Isn't that fascinating? And they're brought up by the same parents, one a very old man, the other one a very young mother. So there's something unique about this story. They had the same upbringing, these two boys, the same parents, the same home. Now we're going to see in our studies that this setting was very important to Christ, as we shall see, because when he comes into this place and speaks of it and of its history, he's going to pick up what happened in the days of Joash and demonstrate that what happened in those days was a type of himself. So David's throne was seriously jeopardised, as we've just seen there in 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verses 10 to 12, because of Jehoshaphat's compromise with the house of Ahab. But it reached its climax here with the murder by Athaliah of all but one of David's heirs. One evil woman, Athaliah, was outmanoeuvred here by another faithful woman, Jehoshabath, whose oath was Yahweh, to rescue the throne of David from extinction. So here's this woman, saved this 6-month-old Joash from Athaliah with her 95-year-old husband, and hid this young child in the temple and raised him. So this is the period of history that we're considering. You can see down here on the green line of the chart of the chronology of the kings, we have the accession of Joash, but there's a 6-year interregnum in the line of David while Athaliah reigns over the land. And he becomes king at the age of 7, does Joash. Well, of course, you can't rule anything at the age of 7, leave alone a kingdom. And so he depends entirely upon the input of Jehoiada, and we're going to see that. And we saw that when we read, of course, 2 Chronicles 24. You just come to 2 Chronicles 24 and you see in verse 3, or maybe verses 2 and 3, Joash did that which was right in the sight of Yahweh, and then it's qualified. All the days of Jehoiada the priest. Okay? And then it says, and Jehoiada took for him 2 wives, and he begat sons and daughters. So he's totally dependent on Jehoiada the priest. Now, the time came, after 6 years of Athaliah's rule, for Joash to be installed as king. And Athaliah, of course, was slain in the place she only ever visited once, and that was the day of her death. All right? When she went to worship, we can use that word, she went down to the temple of Baal, to her high priest, Matan. Okay? She never came to this place. It was of no interest to Athaliah. But when she heard the shouting of the people and the blowing of the trumpets at the accession of Joash as king at age 7, she came down to inquire, and she cries out, treason, and of course Jehoiada says, take her and put her to death, and that's exactly what happened in the record of 2 Chronicles 23. And if you have a look, just look back at, say, verse 14 of 2 Chronicles 23. Then Jehoiada the priest brought out the captains of the hundreds that were set over the host, and said unto them, have her forth of the ranges, that is, of the courts of the temple, and whoso followeth her, let him be slain with the sword. For the priest said, slay her not in the house of Yahweh. And he does that, of course, because he doesn't want this evil, corrupt woman to be slain in the temple and to defile it. Just her very presence was defiling enough. So they laid hands on her, it says in verse 15, and when she was come to the entering of the horse gate by the king's house, they slew her there. All right, and so here we have the king being declared here in the earlier verses. He stood by the pillar, and great rejoicing now after the death of Athaliah. They get rid of the temple of Baal. They slay Matan the priest in verse 17, and then Jehoiada takes over the kingdom. So that's the transition of power to this man Joash. Now in our King's Notes we call him the ungrateful dependent. You know, if there's one thing that we dislike, and Yahweh certainly dislikes, it's ingratitude. You know, if you see this in your children, if you bring up your children and you devote your life to your children, and then you see ingratitude for what you have done for them and disrespect of parents, it's one of the most hurtful things. And we see it often in life, because we're living in a world today where everybody's out for themselves, and because it's so self-centered, their ingratitude is just part and parcel of the culture of our times. We have to be the exact opposite. The Apostle Paul, for example, was driven by gratitude. The gratitude he felt that God and Christ had extracted him from his course that would have led to disaster, rescued him on the Damascus road, turned his life around. The sense of gratitude that he felt for that impelled him to serve for the rest of his days and to lay down his life. So gratitude is one of the greatest driving forces in our lives. And that's the lesson that will come out of Joash, because he's the antithesis. He's given all this support, and he's brought up by Jehoiada and Jehoshaphat. He's guided as a young man. And yet at the end, when Jehoiada is gone, and even before Jehoiada is gone, we're going to see marks of disrespect emerging, and then ingratitude. And that is what God picks on. You know, it says at the end of chapter 24, he remembered not the kindness of Jehoiada, which he had done unto him. So it was ingratitude that brought about his judgment in the end. So his name means in the Hebrew, Yahweh fired. Well, that's a misnomer, because he was actually Jehoiada fired, if you know what I mean. It was Jehoiada who was behind this man's early success. He reigned for 40 years, which is a considerable length of time. He came to the throne at 7, dies at age 47, which is relatively young. His mother's name was Ahaziah. We read this in chapter 24, verse 1. Yah hath seized, and that is going to be fulfilled at his end, because Yahweh did seize him in a very interesting way. His father's name Ahaziah, and his mother, of course, Zibiah, a female gazelle. Now, as I said, he was contemporary with Jehu, Jehoahaz, and Jehoash, all of whom, of course, were in the dynasty of Jehu. And as we saw yesterday, he was one of those who is significantly omitted from the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1, and we saw the reasons for that, because he turned away to idolatry. Okay, so all of that, of course, means that this man was a failure, a success at the beginning, but a failure. So he was a reforming king, but the Reformation, of course, was really Jehoiada's Reformation, using Joash's power as king to accomplish it. So what were the times of Joash like? Well, they were troublous times, for the north especially. Israel was greatly diminished and impoverished by Syrian invasions under Hazael, king of Syria. Now, just keep him in mind, because he's going to come into our second study big time, Hazael. And I'll tell you why a little later on. Jehu was forced to submit to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, who reigned from 859 to 824. So Shalmaneser came down and made life very uncomfortable for Jehu, and Shalmaneser, of course, is noted for producing the Black Obelisk. Now, some of you will have been into the British Museum and stood beside the Black Obelisk. It was erected in Nimrud about 825 BC, and it was found by Henry Layard, the British archaeologist, in 1846. It was a victory monument of Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria. It stands about 2 metres high, which is about, well, a bit over my height. I stood beside it and had a photograph taken, so my head's somewhere up towards the top of this obelisk. And it's black. It's a black obelisk, that's why it's called that. And it depicts Jehu paying tribute to Shalmaneser. And here he is. So here's the picture, and Jehu, of course, is the one with his face toward the ground. And there's the king Shalmaneser on the left-hand side. And so Jehu is submitting to Shalmaneser. And the interesting thing about this is that this depiction is the earliest known depiction of an ancient Israelite. We get some idea of what they looked like and what they dressed like from this depiction. Not that we can, be 100% sure that the Assyrian artist was true to the facts, because it wasn't always the case. But one would imagine that in terms of the clothing and in terms of the beard and the headgear and so on, that they're probably somewhere pretty close. So it gives you an idea of what Israelites looked like in those days. I want to have a look just now at the two phases of Joash's life, because this is what our two studies are about this morning. We're going to have a look at the first phase, where he's Jehoiada dependent, or Jehoiada fired, unlike his name Yahweh fired. We're going to have a look at him when Jehoiada is dead, when he's ostensibly independent. And he's not independent, as we're going to see, but ostensibly he thinks he's independent and that he can make decisions for himself. Well, on the good side of that, the Jehoiada side of that, he was rescued, raised and found wives by Jehoiada. So his life was totally governed by Jehoiada as a boy and as a teenager, and they used to have children when they were teenagers. He did right, the record says, all the days of Jehoiada. He was minded to repair the temple, and we'll enter into that very shortly and have a look at what he did. He declared his disgust for the desecrators of the temple. We just read that in 2 Chronicles 24. He collected large sums of money for the temple project. He was supported by the princes and the people in that project, and he successfully completed the temple project. So that's a pretty good list of achievements, isn't it? So he's a reformer, mainly in building terms, not so much in spiritual terms. That was left to Jehoiada. But in terms of restoring the temple and so on, he was there at the forefront. He dedicated the vessels for the temple, and he remained faithful all the days of Jehoiada. So that's the good side of this man's life, which is in our first study here today. But we have another side to it, don't we? When Jehoiada is dead, he succumbed to the advances of the princes who had formerly supported the work. He forsook the house of God and turned to idolatry. He refused to listen to the rebuke of Yahweh's prophets, one of whom, of course, and the chief of whom was Zachariah. He gave command to stone his own cousin Zachariah in the court of the temple. He was sorely wounded by Syrian invaders. He was assassinated by his own servants on whom he was entirely dependent at the time. Okay, so it's not a great story, is it? It's true to the key idea behind this series of studies: a reforming king who failed. Okay, so we have another one who can teach us some important lessons. So let's learn the positive lessons from the life of Joash by looking at what he did in relation to repairing the temple. So come to 2 Chronicles 24, and we'll pick this record up at verse 4. And it came to pass after this that Joash was minded to repair the house of Yahweh. Now this word minded, two words in the Hebrew, im-leb, means literally in the heart. So Rotherham faithfully translates that it was near the heart of Joash to repair the temple. Now that's a very good motivation, isn't it? Because when we translate that into our times, what does that mean for you and me? Well, the temple, the house of God, is the ecclesia to us, isn't it? And so therefore, if we have the objective of repairing or mending or doing what we can to support and rebuild the house of God, then that's looked upon with approval by our God in heaven. He wants us to have that kind of spirit, and Joash had that spirit, so we can learn an important positive lesson from him. Now, to be sure, he had Jehoiada behind him, obviously influencing him, but nevertheless, it was in his heart, so he took up this project. The word repair here, chadash, means to make new or to rebuild. So it's about renewing, and Rotherham translates it that way, and occurs again in verse 12, that word rendered a little differently. Mending, so he was mending the house. So this is a repair job on the house of God. The word repair in verse 5, which says, he gathered together the priests and the Levites and said to them, go out unto the cities of Judah and gather of all Israel money to repair the house of your God from year to year, and see that ye hasten the matter, he said. So there's youthful enthusiasm here. And you need that in the ecclesia life, don't you? You need people who have got the energy, and they get in there and they do it as much as they can, as long as they're properly guided by more senior people, as Joash was, by Jehoiada. They can do a lot of good, an enormous amount of good in ecclesial life with the youthful enthusiasm. This word repair means to make strong, to restore to strength, to give strength, and that's what our work in the truth should be about. But, sadly, if you have a look at the end of verse 5, howbeit the Levites hastened it not. And the word here means to prepare quickly. They didn't do it quickly, okay? They didn't do it quickly enough for this young man Joash. He was impatient. He wanted to push on. And the Levites were not quite as enthusiastic as he was. So what does he do? Well, unfortunately, he criticises Jehoiada, and you'll see that in a minute. But I want to just divert now, while we're talking about the positive side of this. I want to come to 2 Kings, the companion account in 2 Kings 12, and see if we can pick up some key lessons here. 2 Kings 12, verses 4 to 6. Just adds some information that we don't get in the book of Chronicles. You can pick it up again at verse 4. 2 Kings 12. And Jehoash, now you'll see the spelling is a bit different there, but it is the same name, Joash, said to the priests, all the money of the dedicated things that is brought into the house of Yahweh, even the money of every one that passeth the account, the money that every man is set at, and all the money that cometh into any man's heart to bring into the house of Yahweh. You notice how I paused, so we got three things there? Because there are three things there, and they're very important, and we're going to see how they fit into the context here. So what does it mean? Every one that passeth the account. Well, the word passeth, abar, pass along or cross over. The word is used in Exodus 30 verse 13 of the half shekel of the sanctuary paid by every Israelite numbered in a census. You know what happened? There was only one reason you could take the number of Israel, and that was to collect the half shekel of the sanctuary. And of course, we know that it was silver, Silver is the symbol for redemption, and the half shekel, which is a very small amount, was to indicate that whether you were rich or poor, you all had the same need. Rich or poor, we're all mortal. They all had the same need for redemption, silver. Okay, so you all paid the same amount because you're acknowledging to God, you're sons of Adam, you needed redemption from sin and death. That was the purpose of collecting this half shekel of the sanctuary. So it was still happening. People were bringing their half shekel of the sanctuary. And that, by the way, means that it was obligatory or mandatory. Now, there was no way of saying, well, look, I don't want to pay it. You had to pay it. So this is something laid upon people. It was obligatory. But then it says, in the second part of that, it says that the money that every man is set at. Now, the Hebrew word here, erek, means to estimate or to give a valuation to something. It is used 9 times in Leviticus 27, verses 2 to 8, of the price to redeem vows, which were actually estimated by the priest. So if you wanted to redeem a vow, you had to bring along the appropriate sacrifice, whatever, and the priest would lay upon you a certain amount that would fulfill that vow, so to speak. And whatever he said, whatever his estimation was, that's what you paid, okay? So this is money that was collected for the temple, for the priesthood, in that form. So what would that be? Well, that's assessed or appointed. So the first one was obligatory or mandatory. The second one is a matter of assessment that is appointed to you by someone else. But look what then comes along here. And all the money that cometh into any man's heart to bring it into the house of Yahweh. What's that? Voluntary, isn't it? This is something that's not appointed, it's not obligatory. It's something you bring along out of the free will of your own heart. Okay, so there were 3 forms of contribution to the repair of Yahweh's house. Think about our state. Where do we sit in the scheme of things, in our relationship to the house of God, the ecclesia? Are there certain things that are obligatory for us? Yes. Forsake not the assembling of yourselves together. Meet every first day of the week to remember the sacrifice of Christ. Is that obligatory? Well, of course it is. We're commanded to do that, aren't we? It's not a matter of choice. We're commanded to do that. So that's the obligatory, mandatory portion of our service. And if we didn't turn up to the meetings, would the ecclesia function? Would the house of God be repaired? Don't think so. Okay, so you can see the application to ourselves. Now, what about set at? The amounts that are appointed? Well, in our ecclesia, the arranging brethren sit down after every 6 months, I think they do this, and they actually lay out the program of who will do what in the ecclesia. You're going to do this, and you're going to lead these classes, and whatever else. See, and they make appointments, all right, that we might fulfill our vows, redeem our vow. Right? We made a vow at baptism, didn't we? So the ecclesia is making appointments, and we are under some obligation, obviously, to fulfill those appointments. But then you come to the third matter of voluntary contributions to the repair of the house of Yahweh. So, you might be one of those people that thinks, well, I've got to come to the meetings on a Sunday and I'll fulfill my appointments that the ecclesia makes, but that's the last they'll see me. Right? That's the end of the matter. That's the last they'll see me. When it comes to working bees at the ecclesial hall or to do the hall cleaning or whatever it may be, where you can get away with not turning up, well, I'm not going to turn up. See? You can have that attitude, can't you? But you see, what we're being taught here is that the proper approach, which Joash had, the proper approach was that there ought to be voluntary contributions over and above our obligations and whatever may be appointed to us. It's got to be the centre of our lives. The house of God must be the centre of our lives. And there must be a voluntary spirit towards it. That's the clear lesson that comes out of this. So let's just summarise. Building in the house of God, as we find it here in 2 Kings 12:4-6. So let's just read on here. Verse 5, Joash says, let the priests take it to them, every man of his acquaintance, and let them repair the breaches of the house, wheresoever any breach shall be found. So these 3 forms of contribution are designed to patch up or mend any breaches in the house of God. We always got breaches in the house of God. I've not known a time in my 50 years in the truth where there hasn't been breaches in the house of God in some form. There's never any excuse for not doing any work in the truth, is there? Never. So that's the clear principle that we have coming out here. Verse 6, but it was so that in the 23rd year of King Joash, the priests had not repaired the breaches of the house. So Joash was frustrated. He's very frustrated because it wasn't happening like it should have happened. And sadly, of course, I've got to be careful what I say. I'm not always careful what I say, but I must be careful what I say. That where I come from, one of the great problems we have right now in 2017 is we cannot get enough people to fulfil the appointments in the ecclesia. We cannot get people to work in the ecclesia. It's very, very sad. But we're not the only ones, because wherever I go I find the same message. So one of the things we have to take away from this study is that we must make our contribution. We must get in there and do whatever we can, whatever is within the capacities that we have, we must get in there and do it. So let's summarise it. The three forms of contribution to the house of God and their antithesis, because there is an antithesis. And the antithesis was provided by Athaliah and her sons and their attitude towards the house of God. So, number one, the duty required of every man. In other words, submission to obligations. Now, the antithesis to that is lawlessness. I don't care attitude, see? The second one, the value of dedication over and above duty. That is, appointment. Willingness to offer more in building. Now, the antithesis of that is deliberate breaking down, isn't it? It's opposite end of the scale. The third, offerings freely given from the heart. That is total dedication to Yahweh. And the antithesis of that is dedication to false gods. Okay? Now that was the policy of Athaliah and her sons. And we're going to see that when we come to the record of her. So come back to 2 Chronicles 24 and we see what was said about Athaliah and her sons. What their attitude was like towards the house of God. 2 Chronicles 24 and verse 7. For the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken up the house of God, and also all the dedicated things of the house of Yahweh did they bestow upon Balaam. Now that is the antithesis of what we've been reading in Kings. Now these sons of Athaliah were the older brothers of Ahaziah, who were ultimately taken away by the Philistines and the Arabians. We read that record in 2 Chronicles 21 and verse 17. They met a sticky end because of their attitude to the temple of God. That wicked woman, the Hebrew word, means a female wicked doer. And Rotherham translates it, Athaliah, the lawless. So there we've got the power behind this kind of attitude towards the temple. Athaliah, the lawless. So the policy of Athaliah was clear from that verse, wasn't it? She encouraged and promoted lawlessness among God's servants. She used the immature to desecrate and break up the house of God, the ecclesia. If I had to suggest where most or some of our problems are coming from today, it's from some of our younger folk who are imbued with the spirit of humanism and, you know, gadgetry and all that sort of stuff, which has skewed their thinking. Okay, a lot of it's coming from that area, and they're not doing, some of them not doing great things for the house of God. And she dedicated the vessels, and of course we know vessels represent individuals in the house of God. She dedicated vessels belonging to Yahweh to worldly gods. So there's the exact antithesis to what Joash was setting about to do. Okay? So when you compare the two records, you can see that they relate to one another. So while we're here now in 2 Chronicles 24, let's see if we can see what happens to the attitudes of Joash. He starts very well. And when you get to verse 6, there's a problem that begins to emerge. Look at verse 6 of 2 Chronicles 24. Because the Levites hastened not the building or repairing of the house of God, he got a little agitated. And verse 6, and the king called for Jehoiada the chief, and said unto him, why hast thou not required of the Levites to bring in out of Judah and out of Jerusalem the collection according to the commandment of Moses the servant of Yahweh, and of the congregation of Israel for the tabernacle of witness? Okay. Well, this is youthful, unthinking, youthful criticism. And we can learn a lesson out of this too. Jehoiada was his father and mentor. Joash was the son, an adopted son and student. Jehoiada was nearing 130 years of age. Now 3-4 days at a Bible school has worn out people who are in their 40s or 50s. Okay? You get my point? This man has been labouring in the truth assiduously for 100 years. Okay? That's a long time to be labouring in the truth. He can be forgiven for being a little bit worn out. And you and I, when we get towards the end of our life, our powers fail, do they not? Our memory fails, just our strength fails. We can't do what we did when we were younger. It's impossible to do it. So you see, this was unthinking, youthful criticism. He didn't think, well, you know, my father has really got to the end of his life. He brought him in and castigated him, tore strips off his adopted father, Jehoiada. Not good at all. He was paying no respect and honour to him, not taking into account the position that he was in. He was worn out and tired, was Jehoiada, whereas Joash was at his prime. His strength was fading. Joash was young and strong. Jehoiada was looking for rest and release. Joash was looking to make his mark. It's not always an uncommon thing, is it? You know, the older folk are pushed aside because the young Turks want to get in there and make their mark. Jehoiada had shown a lifelong patient endurance of good service, as we're going to see in a moment. Joash is involved in youthful, unthinking criticism that's not going to lead to good things. You know, one of the things that is of great distaste to me, and I know to some folk that are older than me, is the lack of respect that is shown to older brethren who have given so much good service and have remained faithful for so long. I find that very difficult to bear. And so does God. So he pays a price for this. He pays a price for this, as you're going to see, because he gets a lack of respect from people that he should expect respect from. Okay, so that's where it ends up. You're poetically served. There's no question about that, as we're going to see in the case of Joash. So let's come down then and see what happens at the end of this period of Jehoiada's overshadowing of Joash. We'll come down to verse 12, because they actually get their act together. They collect more money and they get their act together. They get the workers involved. And verse 12 tells us, and I want you to notice the phraseology here. Notice who's here still. And the king and Jehoiada. Notice this. The king and Jehoiada gave it to such as did the work of the service of the house of Yahweh, and hired masons and carpenters to repair the house of Yahweh, and also such as wrought iron and brass to mend, to repair the house of Yahweh. So the work went ahead. Now, there's a very interesting word in verse 13. So the workmen wrought, and the work was perfected by them, and they set the house of God in his state and strengthened it. Now I find that curious. So what it says, it doesn't say they set the house of God in its state, but in his state. What does that sound like to you? It sounds like the body of Christ to me. It sounds like the ecclesia, the body of Christ, the house of God. His state, see? Now I'll come to that in a minute because it's quite important. But let's just step back to this word perfected in verse 13. There are two Hebrew words here, Elah, Aryukah. Now we know what al means, don't we? It means to ascend, Allah, to ascend. Literally, it means to ascend to wholeness. So all of this work that they put in to repair the house of God is likened here to the ecclesia, and it's ascending to wholeness. Okay? Now you'll see the point of this in a minute. They set, two Hebrew words again, eth amad, to stand itself. So it's ascending to wholeness, to stand itself. And of course the house of God in the Hebrew is Bayith Elohim. Literally, the house of mighty ones, which is exactly what the ecclesia is, isn't it? In 1 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16, when Paul has talked about the house of God, he says that the ecclesia, which is the house of God, the pillar and ground of the truth, he goes on to talk about God manifestation, that Yahweh is manifested in the members of this house. So he walks about in them, says Paul. So it's the house of mighty ones is the ecclesia. So you got a picture of where this is heading? Yeah. And it's deliberately heading there because the message that's coming out of this chapter is what we should be doing today in the house of God. At the end of that verse, in his state it said, again, two Hebrew words, literally, to his proportion. So it's ascending to wholeness, to stand itself as the house of mighty ones, set in its proportion. Right? That is language pregnant with meaning. And it's all spelled out for us in the New Testament. And then it says, at the end of verse 13, he strengthened it to make it firm, as the word means in the Hebrew. I want you to come to Ephesians chapter 4. Just put something in 2 Chronicles 24 if you can. Come to Ephesians chapter 4. Because this is the Spirit's commentary on what happened in the days of Jehoiada and Joash. Now this is pretty familiar territory for us. We're going to read it from verse 11 of Ephesians 4. Speaking about Christ who ascended up to his Father. In verse 11, he gave some apostles and some prophets and some evangelists and some pastors and teachers. So what do you think the main message there is? It's only the word of God that can build the house. What was the reputation of Jehoiada? A teaching priest, okay? Great teaching priest. Verse 12, what was the purpose of all of this? Why all this education to repair? Verse 12, for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying or building up of the body of Christ. So what's the final objective here? Verse 13, till we all come in the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Okay? You getting the message here? This is what was happening in the physical way, a physical form of building or repairing the house of God of old. Now I'm going to jump verse 14 and come down to verse 16. Because this is about the body of Christ, of which he is the head, as we read in verse 15. From whom the whole body, fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. That's the story of 2 Chronicles 24, isn't it? 13 and 14. But I missed something, didn't I? What did I miss? Well, I missed verse 14 and 15. Because this is the next part of the story of Joash. As soon as Jehoiada dies, the princes who had once supported the work come and put pressure on him, and he turns away to idolatry and forsakes the house of God. Why? Well, look at what verse 14 says. That we henceforth be no more children. This was Joash's problem. He was Jehoiada dependent. And as soon as Jehoiada was gone, he showed himself to be the child that he really was. He wasn't a mature, independent adult who had made up his own mind that this was his life and it wouldn't matter what happened. He was not going to be moved from this path. Jehoiada can die, the whole ecclesia can fall over. I'm not going to move from this path. He wasn't like that. He was dependent on Jehoiada, and when Jehoiada died, he showed himself to be dependent on others. He was not an individual in his own right who'd made up his own mind where he was going. Okay, that's the lesson we learn. So verse 14 says, "We be henceforth no more children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the sleight of men." And we're going to see some of that sleight of men in a minute. "And cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive." And the princes who ostensibly were supporting this work were there rejoicing when they were gathering the money for the repair work. As soon as Jehoiada was gone and the rock of Gibraltar had disappeared, they turned. They were lying in wait, ready to do their work of deceit on Joash. So this is a commentary on 2 Chronicles 24. What should we be doing? Verse 15. "But speaking the truth in love may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ." So this is why we read about this house ascending to wholeness, to stand as the house of the mighty ones, set in his proportion, right? That's what the ecclesia should be doing, growing up into the head. All of that is prefigured in the work of Jehoiada and with support from Joash until Jehoiada dies. Tragic situation here. Let's come back then and just wind up this little section that leads up to verse 15, because that will be where we begin in our next study, God willing. It says at the end of verse 14, "They offered burnt offerings in the house of Yahweh continually all the days of Jehoiada." Yep. So what do the vessels represent that they offer in that verse? Vessels of gold and silver, it says. Well, gold, of course, is the symbol for tried faith, isn't it? And silver, the symbol for redemption. And vessels, we know from 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 20 to 21, is a reference to the individuals in the house of God. And there are some vessels to honour, and there are some vessels to dishonour. They made burnt offerings, of course. Burnt offerings spoke of dedication mentally, morally and physically to God, head first. Then came the fat around the vital organs, the things that the real you, the heart of man. And then came the innards and the legs, the active things, the works. So it's mental, moral, physical. That was the form in which the burnt offerings were made. They were offered continually. The word that is used throughout Numbers 28 of the continual burnt offering, because that's what God wants, continual service. But the stability of this reformation is attributed to Jehoiada. It says at the end of that verse, all the days of Jehoiada. Okay, it's attributed to him. And later on, see in verse 15 and 16, we have, of course, the imprimatur of Yahweh himself on the character of Jehoiada, because he had done good in Israel, both toward God and toward his house. And if you wanted to have anything said about you at the end of your days, what would it be? Would it be something like that? Wouldn't it be something like that you had done good in Israel, the Israel of God, both toward God, because he's at the top of your list of priorities. He's right there at the head of the list. When it comes to what this individual is going to do, Yahweh, the God, the great covenant God of Israel, is right at the top of the list. Right? That's what Jehoiada was like. Toward God. And if you've got that kind of attitude towards God, guess what it produces? Love of the ecclesia. Love of the brotherhood. That's what it produces. And you'll get in there and do what you can for it. Okay? And so we've got a man who sets the pattern for us. He had done good in Israel, both toward God and toward his house. Let's hope that can be said of each one of us at the judgment seat of Christ, which cannot now be very far away. And we're not far away in distance from where it's going to be held either. You know, so who knows whether we'll actually get home. We may get home. We might not be home for very long. And let's hope we're not home for very long. Because that day is coming when the assessment will be made of us as to what we did in the house of God. So here's our chart. We're starting to climb back again, aren't we? Look at Joash there in the middle. We're starting to climb back again in Judah. We're not perfect yet. As we're going to see, it's not perfect yet, but there's some movement back from the decline that came from the compromise of Jehoshaphat with the house of Ahab. And Jehoiada is the man behind all of that, the teaching priest in Judah. In our next study, God willing, study 8, so we've only got 2 more after that, and that's tomorrow's studies. We're getting towards the end. In our next study, we're going to have a look at the death of Jehoiada and the apostasy of Joash and his poetic judgment, a wonderful example of how God deals with people like Joash who turn their back on him. So we'll leave it at that and have a break and then come back and deal with that study.